This is Sg2 Perspectives, a conversation with Sg2 experts and industry thought leaders about the biggest trends in healthcare and what we expect that's going to mean for the future of healthcare delivery. We're always looking for new ideas and topics from our listeners, so please reach out, share your ideas. You can email us at sg2perspectives@sg2.com or connect with us on LinkedIn or Twitter, and you can find links to all that in the show notes. Now, on to this week's episode.
The closest relationship between a health system management team and the board is between the CFO and the board chairman or whoever is on that side. It's been kind of very metric driven. And what I hope happened last year going into this year is that the thinking expanded a bit to some of the topics you brought up, which is look how well we did or look how well we responded. What do we do next? What's our role in the community? And what's our responsibility to our workforce?
Welcome to Sg2 Perspectives. I'm your host, Trevor Durin. Today's the first installment of a new series of conversations. They're going to focus on financial strategy. So for a health system to be successful in 2021 is going to require a new set of priorities, tactics, and probably more short-term planning. The stakes are really high, both in the short-term, mid-term, and long-term futures. They all look really uncertain. And so that's why health system strategy and finance teams that we're talking to are working more closely together than ever. To share how health systems are doing this, we're going to be talking with Bill Woodson, and we've asked Mike Busch to join us. Mike's an executive officer with Vizient, and he leads our networks of CFOs around the country, both large IDNs and AMCs. Mike was both a health system chief operating officer and a chief financial officer before joining Vizient last year. So we love when we have the opportunity to tap into him and hear his experience and perspective. So thank you both so much for joining us today to share your knowledge. So Mike, I'm going to go to you first. You recently shared with the whole Sg2 intelligence team a great list of priorities that many of the health system CFOs you work with expect to be tackling in 2021. What are a few of those top priorities going into this year?
We're going into a new year on the backs of a year of the scope and scale of crisis that we've never seen in our careers. Coming into this new year, I think our financial officers are hard at work to focus on three big topics right now. Obviously, getting back on the growth trail and trying to recover volume that was lost during 2020, as well as population health initiatives and value-based arrangements. Second is really focusing on digital strategy. We saw some really dramatic trends in the spring into the summer last year in the growth of telehealth visits and trying to figure out what that digital strategy is going forward. And the last is on workforce. Our workforce is stressed like no other time in our history, and trying to stabilize the workforce and make sure that we have the resources to take care of patients as we move back up on the growth curve. Those are top of mind for our CFOs.
So does that list look a lot different than that list would have a couple of years ago?
Yeah, Trevor. I mean, growth has always been on the roadmap, and I think even more so now with some of the soft volume that occurred during 2020. Digital strategy has been on the roadmap for a long time, although the velocity of change really has kind of elevated that to a new level. I think going into the next few years, maybe taking a different look to capital allocation and capital prioritization will continue to be top of mind for our CFOs going out beyond 21.
Bill, you want to piggyback on any of those?
Yeah, Mike, in terms of the playbook for any CFO, I might have expected you to say there are still those things there. You're going to pay attention to operating margin, and depending what that number is related to a bond rating, you're going to respond appropriately. That's the old game. I like that you've brought up the new game topics. What you also just brought up, we've talked about for a couple of years, which is what's CapEx moving forward, what's OpEx moving forward, and how do you start to split those apart for a health system, and how you deploy strategic capital, also the margin that you make to keep replacing the market to stay relevant. What I'm hoping is that the crisis of the last year, the command center mentality, has accelerated things for CFOs that have had them rise to the top of the leadership team.
Yeah, Bill, throughout all this, the fundamentals still matter. Preserving cash, having enough cash flow to fund capital priorities, the focus on operations and margin, those fundamentals, I think, are still in play and still mainstream. I don't think they go away. They're probably elevated because we probably have half of the health systems that have recovered financially and half of them are still struggling to get back to break even. I think those fundamentals will still be top of mind for most of the CFOs. And I think the capital allocation will follow cash flow.
I've been thinking, Mike, and you may have experienced this in your career, sometimes the closest relationship between a health system management team and the board is between the CFO and the board chairman or whoever is on that side. It's been kind of very metric driven. And what I hope happened last year going into this year is that the thinking expanded a bit to some of the topics you brought up, which is look how well we did or look how well we responded. What do we do next? What's our role in the community? And what's our responsibility to our workforce?
In that vein, the planning horizons really changed. This is kind of goes back to the link with chief strategy officers. What used to be a 3-year horizon is now a 3-month horizon. And the uncertainty about how do you forecast demand with all the uncertainties is a real challenge for most of our financial officers.
Does this look similar across different types of institutions and organizations? Are there similarities or differences in the priorities between maybe AMCs and community hospitals, between regional systems and independents? Are there some patterns that you're hearing, Mike?
I think that the scale is different in different markets. Most of our large AMCs have multiple missions. They're both a regional tertiary center as well as having community-based health systems in their portfolio. Trying to determine how do they win in those secondary markets where they depend on referrals and how do they focus on growth of some of their signature service lines in the tertiary side. Those fundamentals of growth, I think, are the same, whether you're in the sole community health system, integrated system, or whether you're in the academic medical center system. Some of those fundamentals are the same, although the scale is remarkably different.
Trevor, the metrics say that there's a decent number of health systems that we're sitting on a lot of days cash on hand. So I'm curious to learn, what do they do with that? They just kind of play it out and we'll take care of our employees and we'll keep it going. What sort of changes do we make to our operating model? But also, given health systems with a lot of financial resources, what have they decided to do strategically going to this year and next? We're the fortunate few or the fortunate many. How should we invest carefully, mindful of our capital? How do we play this out? And I think we're going to learn, we're going to see it. There was a sincere discussion about health equity, health disparity, of the health system's role in the community and financially what that means and how that plays out moving forward. It's not just looking at unreimbursed care. Our members recognize through the leadership team, and we have a leadership position to represent here. How will that play out into 2021? And explicitly, I've heard from our members that they're devoting parts of their budget in a different way, allocating growth targets in specific geographies with specific populations. It's a return to the mission discussion that always seemed fairly cynical and jaded to me in a really positive way.
Well, that's a great observation, Bill, because I think they're realizing that, particularly in the behavioral health space, where there's always greater demand than there are resources, focusing on some of those community health initiatives is really positive because coming out of the pandemic, I suspect that the stress level on the behavioral health service line is going to reach new levels, well beyond the capabilities that most health systems have to be able to care for people. Refocusing on some of those social determinants and health variables in communities, I think, is an essential priority going forward.
Here's another question, kind of back to some of the priorities you mentioned up front, Mike. At the end of 2021, do you think more organizations are going to feel like they were successful if they grew revenue, captured new growth, and just kind of tried to find some of the pent-up demand and just got people back in the door? Or are more systems going to feel like they were successful if they can squeak out a little bit of margin in another really tough volume year? For the sake of this argument, you can't say both.
It's a complicated answer because many of our organizations had to really rely on CARES Act money and federal government subsidies to be able to get through 2020. And so they almost have to look at their numbers excluding those subsidies because likely they're not going to return in 21. For organizations who are able to really get back to volumes, let's say by the fall of 20, and get their numbers up to a reasonable level that they were pre-COVID, they're probably confident that they can get back onto the focus of their strategy going forward. Most likely, those were the larger organizations that had stronger balance sheets, stronger days on cash, could withstand that storm during the middle of last year. And then you have those organizations that, despite CARES Act money, are still struggling and trying to figure out how do they get back on a growth curve so they can at least get to the 3 to 6% margins that their bond rating depends on. Those organizations are going to really need to rethink a lot of strategies in terms of partnerships, other affiliations, if they're not able to get the volume back to the level that can get them back to break even. But I suspect that most health systems are focused on what can we do to keep our margins in a position, our cash flow in a position where we can maintain our ratings and we can fund some of the capital priorities going forward.
Mike, what you would do if you could, if you had extra bandwidth, you would acknowledge just what you said and then recognize that there's pent-up demand in lots of clinical areas that are profitable to us. How do we go and get that pent-up demand faster than everyone else in the market? And then maybe get the word out that if you want to be seen by a specialist, get in for a test, we're the place to go. There is a bit of a race. And I'm not going to say market share is going to move drastically this year. I think it's a status quo year for protecting the fundamentals, but there is opportunity if you have the ability to go after it.
Yeah, I think it's an essential priority too, Bill, because I think most of the forecasts show that cost is going to increase going forward for a lot of different variables. In order to maintain margin, our organizations really need to get back on the growth curve. And whether that's taking it away from competitors, whether that's partnerships, organizations that were previously fierce competitors, do they become collaborators now?
Mike, what's capital allocation going to look like in 2021? Is it going to be just pump money into technology to fuel that as a growth channel? Is it going to be about opportunistic acquisitions to use that as a growth channel?
No, I think the whole focus on capital allocation is going to be even a stronger priority now because the organizations that have strong balance sheets, perhaps this will be a little bit of an easier conversation about how they balance allocation. Those that are struggling on the cash side, we have a good number of members that have to pay back some of that PPP money come April and May. And so how they assess that in terms of their ability to have capital to execute on those priorities will be essential. Most organizations really are taking a more cautious look to capital allocation because we still have the dilemma in many members on what percentage of their capital do they allocate to infrastructure and what percentage do they allocate to growth and technology that will yield benefits going forward in terms of their growth trajectory.
Mike, it's a question I wonder about. And for our larger members who have grown through acquiring other organizations or merging with them, is the routine capital infrastructure allocation stuff going to just come back to bite them? Is it impossible to fund if you play it out? Does it paralyze them strategically or they actually have the resources to do it?
I think most organizations, when they go through the capital process, do their prioritization at the departmental level. And it always seems that there's an infinite need and finite resources. So that dilemma of how do you allocate will be intensified even more. And what bets do they make? Do you bet on some of the digital technologies? Do you bet on what are we going to do with the bricks and mortar projects that are in the pipeline? Do we reconsider? Do we downscale those? Do we look at those differently? Where organizations are going to place their bets will really be important. And then, Trevor, to your point about M&A, I mean, do we allocate a portion of our capital to those transactions that we think are going to produce added growth and added margin? That's going to be top of mind as well. I'm also hearing that maybe there's a shift in how we view credit. The conventional thinking always was, let's maintain our A+ rating because that's really essential to maintaining a strong bond rating. And when you really think about the spread differential on cost between an A or an A- and a triple B, the incremental cost is really small compared to what the accreted benefits would be of a major acquisition of a physician group or some other form of capital growth project that could yield returns. I'm sensing that maybe there's a different thought process about credit, that going from an A- to a triple B may not be that bad when you look at the benefits that an acquisition or a major capital addition might produce for the organization.
I would add to that N of one from a very large, incredibly prosperous health system that said, and this will sound familiar, Mike, that capital planning was an annual event for us, period. It's no longer that. We're revisiting it at least on a quarterly basis about what our priorities are, what should be in the list, what maybe moves down the list. And then they're thinking about their at-risk capital. And what we're seeing is the largest health systems coming together collaboratively to search out for new revenue streams in some of these other areas, which is we can't do it by ourselves, but if we come together, we have new avenues for growth regionally, nationally. That's something we're going to keep an eye on. And it's driven in part because there are disruptors with a lot of money coming into the traditional sphere of the health system.
Yeah, those disruptors are getting a lot more attention as we go forward because they're much more aggressive because of how much capital they have to kind of throw into the market that potentially could have adverse consequences for the growth plans of many of our organizations.
And one of the places that's being disrupted pretty significantly is the landscape of independent and aligned physicians in the market. That's also one of the places where the economics for a health system have always been not ideal. How about that? Will the events of last year be seen as kind of a tipping point in the way health systems think about employment of at least primary care physicians? Is continuing that subsidy going to be seen as the way it's been seen in the past, worth it for everything else you get and for the long-term possible benefits? Or do you think maybe this is an opportunity where things shift back? It's an opportunity for some disruptors to come in and have a different value proposition.
A lot of it depends on where value-based strategy shows up on the strategic radar. And for those organizations that are doubling down on value, then primary care and the currency of covered lives becomes much more important. There's a lot of organizations that believe that they should be doubling down on value and really pulling in more of their community members. And that means different affiliations or acquisitions of primary care groups. Those independent groups that maybe struggled during 2020 may be rethinking their strategy in terms of affiliation, either through partnerships or through acquisition. But primary care, I think, will still be a strong focus going forward, and particularly for those organizations that are heavily invested in value and a value strategy.
Trevor, I think that's an important issue, which is given the current administration, what we hear from the payers, the discussion about value does not go away. And by value, I mean shifting risk to providers. It's still here. It's still in the room. And that remains a really tough one for CFOs who have to figure out an ROI on this. That discussion is still on the table. It's a tough math formula. And the other one is site of care shift. These are going to be new challenges or ongoing challenges that we'll have to weigh in on over the next 24 months, but they're not going away. This is a recommendation. If you are in a position to hit the accelerator to take advantage of these programs, now might be a good time to do it. We certainly understand the philosophy, which is we're sitting on robust, highly reimbursed fee for service. That's great. But if you have a track record, experience, and confidence in what you can do in some amount of risk contracting through Medicare or through other payers, this might be the time to say, let's do some more.
I think that's a great positive place to wrap up. We were high level, but we covered a lot of ground. So thank you so much, Mike and Bill, for sharing your perspective and helping our strategy leaders think about how much more closely they're connected to the short-term financial priorities of their organizations this year.
This has been another episode of Sg2 Perspectives. If you like what you are hearing, please subscribe and don't forget to rate and review. We'd love to hear from you. Please connect with us on LinkedIn or Twitter at SG2 Healthcare. You can also reach us via email at sg2perspectives@sg2.com. Reach out and let us know what healthcare trends are most important to you. Please also listen and subscribe to our colleague Dr. Tom Villanueva's Modern Practice podcast on Vizient's Medical Leadership channel. Tom discusses key healthcare trends through the clinical leadership lens. You can find it wherever you listen to podcasts. Thank you for listening.